Hello there, and welcome to the Mission Gathering Christian Church Disciples of Christ podcast. I know if you just heard Christian Church, you almost clicked away, but maybe you can stay, and I get it. The words have baggage, and believe me, we know. That's actually kind of why we're here and doing this podcast. Because Mission Gathering is a community that is daring to tell the truth about power and daring even to believe that love is stronger than the powers of empire. This season, this Lenten season, we're in a series called Unlearning Empire. And here's what that means. It means we're naming honestly out loud without flinching everything that has shaped us. The stories we inherited about who was worth, who has worth, and who doesn't. The myths that told us scarcity is just the way it is, that violence is normal, that some lives matter more than others, that silence is safer than truth, that this is just how the world works and will always work. We've absorbed those stories. They're in us whether we choose them or not. Empire doesn't ask us for consent, it just teaches us this. So we bring all of it here, because God doesn't meet you in your obedience to unjust systems. God meets you in the scared, uncomfortable, necessary work of unlearning what's been binding you, what's been holding you back. And when we say everyone is welcome here, we really mean it. It's not as a slogan, it's as a commitment. If you're black, brown, Asian, indigenous, or white, if you're straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, queer, trans, non-binary, intersex, or questioning, if you are partnered, single, divorced, polyamorous, or still figuring it out, or maybe it's just complicated, if you are housed or unhoused, neurodivergent or neurotypical, disabled or chronically ill, thriving, or just absolutely exhausted, if you grew up in a church, if you were pushed out of church, if you were taught that God looked nothing like you, if you are listening to this today with a deep faith, a restless doubt, a righteous anger, or just enough energy to press play, you are welcome here, friend. Fully, joyfully, without any asterisks. Because here's what we believe. Empire loses its grip when people choose truth over denial, relationship over domination, abundance over fear, love over control. We're not here to rehearse the stories that have harmed us. We're here to practice a different way, to unlearn what empire taught us about God, about each other, and about ourselves, and to remember what love has been saying this whole time underneath all of that noise. So if you're willing to keep going, to join us, bring your whole self, bring your questions, bring your resistance, bring your grief, your anger, and your hope, bring your tenderness, bring the parts of you that got disciplined into silence, bring the parts that are still learning how to trust. This is a space where God is already at work in acts of service that look like power turned upside down, and communities that choose care over calculation, and in every single moment someone refuses to look away and instead chooses to love more deeply. Welcome to Mission Gathering. Welcome to Unlearning Empire, and welcome to a community where empire does not get given the final word, because love gets the final word. Hey, welcome back to our show. If you're new here, welcome. You picked an interesting episode to start with, and we're going to go some places that I think they're going to sit with you for a while. At least I hope they do. And if you've been with us through this Lent series of Unlearning Empire, we're in the middle of it. And we're asking hard questions about what we've been taught to see, what we've been taught to ignore, and what it would mean to actually follow Jesus, who kept doing the exact thing that got him killed, which was telling truth about power. Today we're in John chapter 9, the healing of the man born blind. And I want to warn you up front, this story is not just about a miracle, it's about who gets to define reality. It's about who benefits from your blindness. And it's about what happens when you start to see. So let's get to it. I want to start somewhere that might feel a little bit abstract, but stay with me because this is the foundation that everything else in this podcast is going to be built on. Most empires don't survive primarily through armies, they don't survive primarily through laws or explicit violence. They absolutely use all of that. We're seeing that happen right now. But they survive through stories. Stories that explain the world in ways that protect power, stories that feel like common sense, stories that feel like just how things are. Stories that are so embedded in the culture, you absorb them before you're old enough to even question them. And specifically, stories that can explain suffering in ways that make the system look innocent. If someone's poor, they must have done something bad. They must have made a bad decision. If someone's sick, they must have done something wrong to become sick. If someone is excluded and pushed out, locked up, left behind, there must be a reason, a moral reason, a reason that locates the problem in the individual and not in the structure the individual exists in. You see, blame is one of empire's oldest and most effective tools. Because here's what blame does. It closes the investigation before it starts. If your suffering is your fault, your choices, your failures, your sin, then no one has to ask whether the system that produced your suffering is itself unjust. The system stays clean, the people who benefit from the system stay comfortable, and you stay isolated in your own pain, convinced that it's yours alone to carry. The Brazilian liberation theologian Leonardo Boff wrote that the opposite of love isn't hatred, it's indifference. And I think about that a lot because indifference doesn't feel violent, right? In the way that we've been taught that violence feels. It feels neutral. It feels like minding your own business. It feels like that's not my problem. But indifference grows in places where people have stopped seeing, where the story has already been explained, this and has already explained the suffering away, filed it under personal responsibility, and moved on. You don't have to look away from what you already explained away. And that's what the blame narrative does. It inoculates you against seeing. It gives you a story to hold up in front of the reality so you never have to actually look at reality as it is. And we breathe this air constantly. It's in our politics, our economics, our religious frameworks, our self help cultures. The message is everywhere. Your outcomes are the results of your choices. Work hard enough, believe hard enough, make the right decisions, and you'll be fine. We've been taught that that sounds like empowerment. But for a lot of people, people who aren't at the top of the system, people who aren't as comfortable as you and I may be, it functions as cruelty. Because what it actually says to someone ground down by the systems they didn't design and didn't choose, it says that this is your fault. And if you believe that, if you internalize that long enough, you stop asking whether anything needs to be changed. Empire doesn't need to chain you if you already convinced yourself that the cage you're in is your fault. Okay, so you came here for a Bible lesson. I get that. And so John 9, right? The story we're in is in John 9. Jesus and his disciples are walking along and they encounter a man who's been blind since he was born. His whole life. He hasn't had a period of sight that was taken from him. He's never seen anything at all. This is all that he's never ever known. And before anyone does anything, before anyone asks this man what he needs or wants, before anyone introduces themselves, the disciples ask a question. They say, Rabbi, who sinned? Was it this man or was it his parents that he was born blind? And I want to sit here for a second because I think we're tempted to read the disciples as callous here. as if they're being cruel, but I don't think that's the right way to look at it. The disciples aren't villains, they're not monsters, they may be thick headed at times, but they're asking the question that the entire religious and cultural world had taught them to ask. They're speaking from where they come from. In the theology of their time, suffering was often understood as divine punishment. Physical disability, illness, and poverty, these were frequently read as signs of sin, either personal or inherited. The framework was God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. So if you're suffering, the logic runs backwards. You must have done something wrong. This is not ancient weirdness. We have this exact theology today, don't we? The prosperity gospel is preached all over this nation. The idea that faith produces wealth and suffering signals spiritual failure. It's one of the most popular theological frameworks in American Christianity, and more people preach it than think that they preach it. It's the same logic, the same blame. It's just a different century, different culture, and different language. So the disciples aren't being uniquely cruel, they're being trained. They're applying the framework their world gave them. I think that's actually more unsettling of a read, right? Because it means that this isn't about bad people. This isn't about villains or comic book style bad guys. It's about bad frameworks that good people can inhabit without even realizing that they're doing it. So they ask their question, and Jesus does what he often does. Jesus refuses the question entirely. He doesn't say it was this man's sin or it was his parents' sin. He says neither. Neither. And that word, that single word, is more radical than it sounds. Because Jesus isn't just answering the question, he's dismantling the premise. He's saying the framework you're using to understand this person's life is wrong. The question you've been taught to ask is the wrong question, which raises the uncomfortable follow up. What other questions have you been taught, right? Have you been taught that are also wrong? You see, Empire asks who deserves this suffering. And Jesus asks, what would healing look like? I want you to feel how different those are. Because they don't just lead to different answers, they lead to entirely different ways of seeing and being in the world. The first question, who deserves this, is a question that already starts with judgment. It's backwards looking. It's about assigning responsibility for what already is. And crucially, it's a question that once answered doesn't require you to do anything about it. If someone deserves their suffering, your job is done. Pack it up, go home. You've understood it, you can move on. The second question, what would healing look like? Is a question of imagination and action. It's forward looking. It requires you to actually engage with the person in front of you, to encounter them, to see them. It requires you to think about what they need, what the world looks like if they're whole, what would have to change in order for their wholeness to begin or to happen. One question closes and alienates, the other opens and ingratiates. The theologian James Cone, right? Dr. James Cone, one of the most important American theologians of the 20th century and the founder of Black liberation theology, wrote that the task of theology is to speak about God from the standpoint of the oppressed. Not from the standpoint of the comfortable, not from the standpoint of those whose frameworks have been built to protect their position and their comfort, from the standpoint of the people at the bottom, the ones that the system doesn't work for at all, or in fact, better said, that the system works against. And from that standpoint, if God starts with those who have been pushed out, those who are starting at the bottom, from that standpoint, suffering looks completely different. It's not primarily about personal failure or divine punishment. It's about systems, structures, histories, policies. It's about assumptions so deeply baked into institutions that people stop recognizing them as assumptions and start treating them as nature. But, friends, I'm going to let you in on a secret. Poverty rate, poverty isn't natural. Incarceration rates aren't natural. The way disability gets treated in our culture isn't natural. These are choices. They are the accumulated result of decisions made by people with power over time in ways that always seem to benefit some people more than others. When you change the question, you change what becomes visible. And when what becomes visible, when you actually look, is threatening. Here's the part of the story that I think gets skipped over, that I think we just rush past because we want to get to the miracle and feel good about it. The part of the story that gets skipped over so much is that healing, truly healing, is dangerous. Not because healing is bad, healing is beautiful. But healing reveals something that a lot of people in power would rather have stay hidden. Think about the man in this story. He's been blind his whole life. So he sits and begs, takes handouts from people. That's his economic position. That is his role in society, his community's ecosystem. He's just the guy who's blind begging. People have built their entire understanding of him, his worth, his purpose, his place around his blindness. The religious authorities have theological explanations for it. The community has a social category for it. Everything is arranged. And then Jesus comes along. Then he can see. And suddenly, everything that was arranged has to be rearranged. The theological explanation collapses. The social category doesn't fit anymore. The system that positioned this man as less than, as other, as someone to walk past on your way to more important things, that system has to reckon with who the man is who is now standing in front of them, recovering his dignity, looking back at them with clear eyes. You see, healing rearranges the world, and the world, specifically those whose comfort depends on the world staying arranged as the way it is now, that kind of world, those powers, they don't like it. I think about this in terms of contemporary movements for disability justice, right? The disability rights movement has been saying for decades our problem is not our bodies, our problem is a world built by and for non disabled people that treat disabilities as a deviation from a norm rather than a part of the full range of human experience. The medical model of disability says something's wrong with you and we need to fix it so you can participate in normal life. The social model says something is wrong with the environment and we need to change the environment so that everyone can participate. Those are wildly different frameworks. One of them requires a lot more of the people with power than the other one does. Disability theologian Nancy Eiesland wrote something that completely reoriented how I think about God and bodies. And we're coming up on Easter soon, folks. She wrote that in the resurrected Christ, what emerges is a disabled God. The risen Jesus, the post resurrection Jesus who appears to Mary, to Thomas, to the disciples on the road, still carries the wounds, still carries the scars, still carries the body that has been marked by violence and suffering. Which means the resurrection doesn't erase the marks of what happened, it includes them, it honors them. The body of God in the Christian story is a wounded body, a scarred body, a body that the world tried to destroy and couldn't. That's a radically different theology of the body than the one most of us were handed. Most of us were handed a theology that treated disability and suffering as problems to be overcome, deficits to be corrected, signs that something was going wrong. And Iceland says, look, look at the risen Christ and tell me again that a wounded body is less than. Theologian John Swinton, who's spent his career working at the intersection of theology and disability, put it simply: the church is called to be a community where nobody is forgotten. Friends, empire builds systems that forget people, systems that sort people by productivity, by availability, by usefulness, by what they can contribute to a GDP, and then discards the ones that don't measure up. But the gospel builds communities that remember everyone, that insist every single body matters, that refuse the logic of expendability. Those are two fundamentally different projects. And you can't do both at the same time. Okay, so this healing happens, right? Back to Jesus and the blind man. And the man can see. And for a moment, just for a moment, people are amazed. But then what happens? Then the authorities show up. And the whole tone of the story shifts in a way that I think is very recognizable if you've ever been told an uncomfortable truth in an institutional setting, or if you've ever told an uncomfortable truth in an institutional setting. They interrogate this healed man. They question his parents. They bring in Jesus for investigation. They argue about procedure, specifically whether the healing was legal because it happened on the Sabbath, and you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Is healing work or is it not work? Apparently, this is a more pressing question than the fact that the man who has never seen in his life can now see. The philosopher Michel Foucault spent a lot of his career thinking about how power operates. One of his central insights was that power doesn't function only through force. It functions by controlling what people believe is normal, by shaping what questions get asked, what gets counted as knowledge, what kind of bodies and behaviors and ways of being get defined as acceptable or deviant. He wrote that power produces knowledge, that power and knowledge are completely entangled. And if you control the story, you control what the people think they see. And so empire manages blindness not accidentally, actively, and intentionally. It's not that empire fails to see injustice. It's that empire has a vested interest in making sure you don't see it either. Empire doesn't want you to see how racism structures opportunity from birth through zip codes and school funding and generational wealth and a thousand other mechanisms that are never called racism because they've been laundered through race neutral language. Empire doesn't want you to see how ableism ranks human bodies by their economic productivity and then builds entire systems, educational, medical, architectural, legal, and everything around that ranking. Empire doesn't want you to see how the labor that keeps society running, care work, domestic work, emotional labor, it's almost entirely performed by women and almost entirely unpaid or severely underpaid, because the people who designed the economy didn't count that as real work. Empire doesn't want you to see these things because blindness to this is useful and seeing is dangerous. And so the man who can see becomes a problem. He keeps answering questions. He keeps telling the truth about what happened. He doesn't have a sophisticated theological framework. He can't cite scripture or argue doctrine. He keeps saying, I was blind and now I see. This is what happened. Draw your own conclusions. And that simplicity, that stubbornness, that refusal to complicate his testimony to make the powerful more comfortable, it costs him everything. They throw him out, they expel him, they cast him out of the community, exclude him from the institutions. Because the most dangerous person in a system built on blindness is someone who can see and won't stop talking about it. I'm going to spend some time with a few thinkers here because I think their voices are essential to this conversation. And I think a part of what it means to have dangerous sight is knowing whose vision you've been deprived of, whose analysis and theology and wisdom have been systematically excluded from the mainstream conversation. Howard Thurman, the mystic and black theologian, philosopher, one of the intellectual architects of the American Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King Jr., carried a copy of Thurman's most famous book, Jesus and the Disinherited, with him everywhere he went. Gandhi read it. Thurman asked what I believe is one of the most important questions in American Christianity. He asked, what does the gospel say to those whose backs are against the wall? Not an abstract question, not a theoretical exercise, a survival question. A question asked from inside of suffering, from inside of the experience of being black in America, from inside the reality of a faith that has been used to both oppress and to liberate. And Thurman's answer was that Jesus himself, a person whose back was against the wall, a poor Jew living under Roman occupation, a member of a colonized people, and that the gospel read from that position looks completely different than it does read from a position of comfort and power. Kelly Brown Douglas, a womanist theologian and Episcopal priest, one of the most important theological voices in America right now, she pushes that further. She argues that Christianity in this country has been deeply and structurally entangled with systems of white supremacy, that the Christianity most Americans inherited was shaped by what she calls the Anglo-Saxon myth, a theological framework that has fused Christianity with whiteness and used that fusion to justify slavery, genocide, colonization, and an ongoing racial hierarchy that we still have today. She argues that faith, real faith, takes seriously the God of the Exodus and the Jesus of the gospel. And that faith must name this directly, must confront the lie, not abstractly, but by name. Seeing clearly means seeing history more clearly, not the sanitized version, not the mythological version, not the version that makes the dominant culture feel good about itself, the actual history with actual consequences, which are still unfolding right now, because blindness is not neutral. Blindness is always, always protecting someone. And it almost never protects the people at the bottom. There's another voice I want you to hear. His name's Brian Stevenson. He's a human rights lawyer and the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, author of Just Mercy, right? Not a theologian exactly, but someone whose work saturated with prophetic vision of justice. He's someone that's thinking the questions and doing the work. Stevenson says that the opposite of poverty is not wealth, that the opposite of poverty is justice. I'm going to say that again. The opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. And I want to stay with that for a second, because our culture's entire framework for addressing poverty is built on the idea that the solution is wealth. The solution is growth, opportunity, a rising tide that lifts all boats. Give people access to the economy and poverty will solve itself. But Stevenson says something different. He says the problem isn't primarily the lack of material resources. It's the lack of justice. It's systems that are designed, whether intentionally or through accumulated bias, to produce and maintain inequality. And the solution isn't just more resources, it's transformation of the systems themselves. Justice requires vision, and it requires seeing what you were trained not to see. And then, and this part that costs something, is once you see it, you have to do something about it. I want to talk real quick. I don't want to not push past something in the Jesus story, because I could talk about everything else all day long. I think it's really easy to rush past this, but Jesus heals the man by spitting into the dirt, by making mud, literal dirt and saliva mixed together and applied to someone's eyes. Which, I mean, is weird, right? Jesus has done other healings. He's healed people with a word, with a touch, with a command from across a distance. He doesn't need mud. He doesn't need to spit and to the dirt, the mud is a choice. And I think it's a deeply intentional one. Because what the mud does is it roots this miracle in the physical world, in matter, in soil, in earth, in the body. It's not an abstract spiritual transaction. This is not a philosophical shift in perspective. This is dirt under the fingernails. This is saliva. This is something that came from inside Jesus' body, mixed with the ground he's standing on and pressed against someone's skin. The incarnation has always been the scandal at the center of Christianity. The claim that God took on a body, God got hungry, God got tired, God got dirty, God got killed. Not in spite of having a body, but through having a body. I think the mud right there is a sign of that. A reminder that God is not interested in escaping this physical world. That God is interested in healing the material, physical world. I think that matters enormously for how we understand justice work. There's a version of progressive faith, and I've been in rooms where this happens, that is almost entirely intellectual, where the work is about updating frameworks, changing language, getting the analysis right. And the analysis matters. The frameworks matter. The language by God matters. But the mud says to us that healing has to touch something real. It has to touch bodies. It has to touch communities. It also has to touch the actual material conditions of people's lives. Their housing, their healthcare, their safety, their economic stability, their access to beauty and rest and belonging and joy. You cannot heal someone's life from a distance. You have to get close enough to get dirt on your hands. The incarnation is not a metaphor, and neither is justice. Here's one of the things I love most about how the story is structured. The man's sight, his ability to see and understand what happened to him, grows over the course of the chapter, right? It's not instant. It's not a sudden, oh wow, this has happened, complete illumination. It's a development. It's in stages. It's in stages, especially under pressure of all the questioning. When people first ask him who healed him, he says, the man they call Jesus, he doesn't know much. He can't tell you a name. That's it. When the Pharisees interrogate him and demand he condemn Jesus as a sinner, he pushes back. Whether he's a sinner, I don't know. One thing I do know is I was blind and I now see. He's not willing to lie. He's not willing to perform agreement with the powerful. He holds on to what he knows to be true, even when he can't defend the full theological argument. When they push harder, he gets bolder. He says, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Man, there's an edge there, isn't there? There's a sharpness that wasn't there at the beginning. And by the end, when Jesus finds him, after he's been thrown out, after he's been kicked out by the people who kicked him around for all of those years, Jesus finds him and asks, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he says, yes, and he worships. The sight grew, the courage grew, the understanding grew, not all at once, but through the experience of being questioned and pressured and ultimately cast out. And I think if we're honest, that's how it actually works for most of us that are here. You don't wake up one day with complete clarity about systems and power and the history and your own complicity within those things. You start to see one thing, and then someone challenges you, and you have to decide whether or not you're going to hold on to what you know or let them talk you out of it. And then you see a little bit more, and then it costs you something, and then you see more. Consciousness grows under pressure. And meanwhile, this is the great reversal at the heart of the story. The people who were absolutely certain they could see become more and more blind. The Pharisees, the religious authorities, the credentialed insiders, and with theological training and institutional power, the more they resist what's in front of them, the less they can actually see what's in front of them. By the end of the chapter, Jesus says to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, we see, your guilt remains. The claim of perfect vision is itself a form of blindness. The insistence that you already see everything you need to see, that your framework is complete, that there is nothing left that would disturb your understanding, that's how you stop seeing. Humility is a prerequisite for this kind of vision. The man who was blind begins to see. The people who thought they could see go blind. This is not an incidental story. That is the story. Okay, so here's where it lands. I know we've been at this for a minute. I don't want to be abstract about this. I want to ask some specific questions, and I want you to actually sit with these questions. Not just process them intellectually and move on, but to sit with them. Friends, what have you been trained not to see? And I don't mean what does your social media feed tell you to be outraged about. I mean, what is it right in front of you in your actual life and community that you have developed these habits around not looking at? Maybe it's the humanity of people who are unhoused. You've learned to look through on your commute, whose existence you filed under complicated social problem, in a way that lets you keep moving on without being disturbed. Maybe it's the way that disability gets treated in your workplace, in your church, in your social circle. The way accessibility is an afterthought, and the way that neurodivergent people are expected to mask and perform neurotypicality to be accepted. The way that bodies that don't fit the productivity standard get quietly excluded. Maybe it's the racial history, the specific documented traceable history of how wealth was built and distributed and denied in this country in ways that have direct consequences for who has what right now. Not as an abstraction, as history that happened to real people and produced the world that you and I are living in. But maybe it's not that. Maybe it's closer to home. Maybe it's something in your family, in your church, in your friend group. Something you've known is wrong, but have chosen the safety of not naming what you see. Ask yourself that. The next question is, where have you confused comfort with righteousness? Where have you told yourself that staying quiet was the wise choice, the humble choice, the faithful choice, the discerning choice, when it actually was just the safe choice? Friends, Jesus doesn't ask for perfect sight. He asks for honest sight, the willingness to look at what actually is there rather than the story that makes it easier to look away. And then, like the man who was healed, to speak, even when it costs you something, even when the authorities get uncomfortable, even when telling the truth gets you excluded from rooms you used to belong in and institutions you used to be welcomed in. Because that's what happens to the man in the story. His reward for seeing clearly and speaking the truth was expulsion and exclusion. He was thrown out of his community. That's not a small thing. Community is survival. Belonging is survival. Being cast out carries a real cost. And so Jesus finds him after he's been thrown out. Jesus comes looking for him and receives him, which I think is the promise underneath all of this to us. That the community gathered around Jesus is specifically and particularly constitutively made up of people who have been thrown out from somewhere else. That the ones who have been expelled for seeing and speaking are exactly the ones for whom the kingdom is built. Before we go, healing begins with seeing what's dangerous, with dangerous sight. That's the anchor of everything we've talked about today. And I want to be clear about what that means because dangerous sight is not despair. It's not doom scrolling. It's not a posture of cynicism that sees everything that's wrong and concludes that nothing can be right. Dangerous sight. What empire really fears is the willingness to see clearly that because you believe transformation is possible, because you think change can happen, you look at the wound because you believe healing is near. Healing is real. You name the system because you believe that systems can change and what is was it sometimes was not and what is right now can be something else in the future. You tell the truth about what you see because you believe that the truth has power even when it's spoken to those who hold all of the cards. The man who was blind in John 9 doesn't end the story in despair. He ends the story in worship, having been thrown out and found again, having seen something true and held on to it under pressure, having moved from I don't know who healed me to Lord, I believe. That's the arc. That's the invitation. So here's your practice for the week, your invitation to be a part of this. Pick one thing you've been trained not to see. One, not a list, just one. Maybe go read something, really read it, not skim it, from a theologian or writer whose perspective has been historically excluded from the conversations you're a part of. Howard Thurman, Kelly Brown Douglas, disability theologians like Nancy Island or Amos Young or Brian Stevenson in his work with Death Row inmates. Someone whose standpoint is different than yours. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just making eye contact with someone you've learned to look through. Have a conversation you've been avoiding. Name something in the room where truth is unwelcome. Name something true. One step towards honest, dangerous sight. Because here's what I believe, and this is what the story keeps insisting. You are not meant to be blind to the world around you. The God who made you to see the full dignity of every human being. And I'm not just talking about physical sight, right? To see the systems that diminish human dignity, to see the possibility of a world arranged differently, to see the healing that is already happening in the margins in a place where the powerful aren't looking and the communities gathered from the expelled, the cast out, and the thrown away. See it, say it, and trust that the God who heals with mud and spittle, with dirt, with actual messy material of this broken, beautiful world is still at work. That's the invitation. That is the call. Healing begins with dangerous sight. And once you really see, you cannot pretend that you are blind. So, friends, thank you for being here. Share this if it's meant something to you. And please, please, please don't turn a blind eye to what's going on. This world needs you, the church needs you. And Jesus is inviting you into something deeper. God bless.